Okay, today we're doing winning from OG, and then we're just going to do a bonus detour because I actually don't have that many things to say about winning from OG. I kind of realised when I was writing these slides. So we've got, a brief rundown and then a little bit of a matter for you instead. Let's start with PM speeches and OG. So I think this is fairly obvious to most of you, but the main challenge in OG is really staying relevant on the bench because most people will like to make you irrelevant as soon as possible in order to remove you from the debate. And you really need to make sure that you, and your arguments, the way you persuade them and your framing, all needs to be something which fits nicely within the context of the debate so that when the judges get to the adjudication, they don't easily eliminate you from the contention. So, the first way in which you can do this, I think, the easy way is to be good, but I think maybe some of you, is to talk about preemption and framing, right? And this should really come right at the beginning of your prep time, for typically I would say about the first 5 minutes or so, however long your PM will let you get away with basically if you're a second speaker. So what you should actually be doing is being able to pick up on the likely top half clashes which are going to occur. So, you have X debate about, Y thing, and within 5 minutes you should be able to identify how the debate is going to play out, at least till the end of the top half bench, but hopefully beyond that into the back half bench as well, and think about strategies in which you can get away with some things and get around some of the problems you might face. And I think the easiest way ultimately, not just to lose the top half, but to lose the bench to your CG team, is by having some kind of inadequate framing, because if I'm an extension speaker, the thing I want to see most of all is to see an OG team which has an inadequate framing to enable them to win the debate. And that means that I don't even really have to do any particular mechanization or respond to any other teams even in order to beat you. I just need to be able to prove that my framing is more accurate to our surroundings, given that a lot of debates are generally decided by framing. The way in which I typically go about this, you probably do too, is actor analysis, scene setting, so explaining the context of the debate, explaining the context of the world around you, and most importantly making that persuasive, proving some kind of burden or pushing that burden onto other teams or yourself in order to prove this is what we are required to do to be able to win the debate. And then doing a kind of pre-weighing where you think about, if this is our burden, how is it that our arguments are able to actually fulfill that burden effectively? But also why that burden itself is so important in the context of the debate. Again, this doesn't have to necessarily be bulletproof, and I don't think you can really expect it to, given that you have 5 minutes in prep time as the PM speaker, and then you maybe have a minute in the debate at most. So certainly this is going to be something which is challenged strongly and likely rebutted. But at the end of it, the judges should really have a very clear idea of the end goal of your arguments. At least if you get to the end of the first minute of your speech and you as a judge are not sure where they're going, then you're probably in trouble, right? At the minimum, it's not going to be very persuasive. And I also think they should be very clear on your path to victory in terms of even if they know where you're going, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know where you're going to win the debate. So you need to be able to do both of those things. Again, you're much more constrained for time, so this whole thing needs to happen very rapidly. In 5 minutes, I would suggest taking advantage of the time to walk to wherever you're going in order to be able to have this conversation beforehand. So, on to the next slide. The next step is delivering your arguments. Obviously, you've now had your panicked prep time. The key thing here is that I think 6 minutes here should be argumentation. The vast majority of the PM speech should be, pushing lots and lots of mechanization into the debate. You can have some spillover into the DPM. I know that teams are sort of 50-50 on this kind of thing. I tend to, for a policy of sort of when the motion is turf burnable, then you should be able to go into for this. So if you think that the CAs have set a particularly shallow motion or a motion which you can obviously cover within the context of 2 speeches, then I would recommend that there is some spillover into DPM. But mostly that's, again, up to personal preference. Again, your arguments should obviously be linked to the motion, but what you really want to avoid is any kind of meta or mutual exclusivity confusion, which does tend to happen in debates. So if you're in DPM, whoever might throw some shade on you, and your job is to make sure that it's absolutely crystal clear to the judges how your argument is functioning in the debate and why it still stands. Again, all of the premises that you make, and you will have had to have run through these in prep time beforehand, need to be considered and justified. And what you probably should do is when you're talking in that first 5 minutes of prep time about how you think the debate is likely to play out, then you ought to incorporate that discussion into your responses in order to justify them in the first place. And basically that just is going to make your arguments more persuasive, especially once we get to the back half of the bench, right? And again, all of this is, the best answer is probably just that it's realistic. If you find yourself pushing arguments which are there in order to make your argument work, then the argument is probably not going to do very well in the debate. The next thing is that the logical flow of the argument should be very easy to follow. I think this happens quite often in debates, is where the sort of the winning rebuttal which you come up with in your speech, especially in DPM, is often either preempted in the PM or brought up earlier in the DPM, but it's just kind of either forgotten about because you don't make a big deal about it, or it's just kind of too extraneous for the judge to be able to join the dots and say, well, you proved this thing, which means that this thing must be true, and therefore this defeats this argument. You know, realistically, very few judges are going to be able to do that. So it really has to be very obvious and clear and joined up as to how it is you're winning the debate with that response. And again, you really don't want to run too many cases, and there should be time for impacting at the end of those cases, or else we're just kind of left stranded at the end of your speech being unclear, you know, what you're actually proving at the end of it. Okay, DPM speeches. DPM speeches have me asking as well. What you need to do, I think, in DPM, primarily, I think there are other sort of tertiary things going on, but primarily, you need to come up with as much destructive rebuttal as possible, ideally before the debate begins. So after you've had your discussion about how you think the debate is likely to play out, then you should be preempting everything, right? I think provided that you know what's going on in the debate, which obviously I think most of you will, it's likely to show up in the debate at some point in the bench. You know, sometimes left field things do come up, but generally I find if I'm preempting clashes, most of them will end up appearing in some form or another. So it's likely to be useful, at least just to get you thinking about how the debate is likely to go and what kind of responses you can do, even if you're not just directly leading out the responses that you've written at the start. Again, I think you want to think very carefully about your framing, and there needs to be some kind of dialogue with the PM. It can't just be that the second speaker is either imposing the dialogue on the PM because they really don't have enough time to be able to adapt to that if they don't understand it, and it certainly can't be that the PM is imposing it on the DPM, because then you'll end up with an extension with a case which is rushed and doesn't really think about the strategic implications, because that's generally the job of the GPM. Again, we need some clarification on the speech. And you will need to probably spend more time on framing as a way of emoji. There needs to be some kind of explanation again, or usually in the same slot as for the PM in the first minute, which explains the strategic positioning of your case. That means, you know, you need to explain the interaction that just occurred on the top bench between the PM and the LO, and why your ideas in general has more redundancies, or it's more plausible, or it's more convincing, or it's more impactful, right? Again, in the strategic positioning, you probably want to be thinking about in advance about CG. You don't necessarily have the option to be able to, you know, preempt what they're going to do unless they're dumb enough to reveal it in the POI in advance. But you should be able to be thinking about sort of plugging the holes in your case before we get out to the CG bench. And again, you want to destroy the OO case. It needs to be as difficult to credit as possible, because the DLO obviously has way more time than you think about the debate, and they have the last say on the strategy and the meta of the top half. So the more time they spend just rebuilding all the stuff that you've destroyed, the less time they have to think about how they're actually going to win the debate. So you want to basically make life as difficult as possible for them in just the purely, you know, constructive case, constructive side of the argument. Right. Okay, yes, I'm.
What do you mean by redundancies?
Basically, there's sort of contingencies and backups. You know, like if one argument fails, you know, or one step of your argument or your logic chain fails, then here's why the argument is still important in the debate, which I think is very useful in OG, because quite often you've got 3 speeches of responses or 4 speeches of responses, so there is going to be a lot of flack thrown at your argument, so it probably does need more redundancy than, say, a CEO argument which gets maybe 2 minutes of responses. Yeah.
I suck at preempting redundant. How do you do it?
Debate lots of debates. I suppose maybe just practice PM slightly more, or practice the skill. Like, look at loads of debates and practice out writing, like, here's response. It doesn't have to take too long, because it's really easy 5-minute thing you can do. You can be like, here's the headline of the debate, here's what I think OG will run, here's what I think OO will run, here's what I think CG will run, here's what CO will run. Yeah.
So, like, the 2 strategies you see, like, in OG is, like, go really, really breadth and just say a lot of what you can, which is what I do, or just pick one specific thing and just weigh that really, really intensely, which is what I see like DPMs like Hadar do. And it seems to be generally the better strategy at a higher level. But how do you find, when you have a lot of cases, how do you find the specific case to then be able to weigh within the round and be able to identify those things? I assume it varies debate to debate.
Yeah, so I agree on the higher level stuff. You probably should only run one argument in a higher level debate, because it never works. To sort of burn. I think, obviously you don't know how the argument is likely to play out in the debate, but I would pick the less complicated argument and I would pick the argument which you think has the clearest path to victory. Like, I just think because you're in such, because you're so time pressured, because you're already at kind of a disadvantage, you don't want to be doing anything elaborate. Save that for CG to mess up. You know, it needs to be the argument which you can convincingly prove and respond to well. Yeah.
So sometimes OO is like really dog shit, and you can respond to them in like 40 seconds. So from here, do you generally opt to weigh the shit out of what PM has said or run an extension? Like what's the decision making process?
If you have an extension, I would run it in that case. If not, I would do the basic responses to OO, but incorporate them into some kind of strategic positioning. I also, it depends how bad OO are, but if they're really bad, you can also just kind of debate against yourself. Like, if you're picking up on the clashes and you think that CO have given away, like, maybe one of the more obvious clashes in the POI, which they do sometimes do, because they won't give away their case, but they'll give away a key framing of rebuttal, then you can very much incorporate that into your speech and, you know, run with that a little bit. But I do agree that it's kind of difficult when the LO is bad from DPM.
Yeah, like just to add on to that, like sometimes like you will be able to respond to your own case, and then it's just fine to just say they will say this, but we will say this in their half, because the way the debate sadly works is like if they do the rebuttal afterwards, sometimes it's a game of who says what first. So if you just like preempt, it is just normal preemption, but I think explicitly flagging they will say this in response to this like allows team to write it down more, like what you were saying earlier.
Yep. Okay, no more questions on winning from OG. You're confident on winning from OG. This is what I expect to see some OG.
What if your prep was really bad? Your prep is horrible. Now you have like one.
I mean, your prep shouldn't be horrible.
Like,
like I think it's damage control at that point. Because if your prep is really bad, like in OG, you're in trouble because you just have no time to resolve it. But if that's the case in your PM, stick with what you know. Don't try and do something which you're not confident in. And if you're in DPM, you obviously have a bit more time, so use that time to figure out what you're doing. You know, in terms of instead of thinking about preemption and rebuttal as strongly, prioritize thinking about case gen a little bit more.
Take some POIs for inspiration.
Yes. Yeah. Instruct your PMs for the POIs. Okay. All right. I think we could move on. So why am I doing this? The reason I'm doing this is I know we had one last year, but things have occurred. There have been events, and I thought I've got some new arguments and things to discuss, which I think will probably be prevalent at next year's majors or Oxford or whatever. Blah 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 blah. What I'm going to be doing is not actually giving you a proper AI workshop, which will probably talk a lot about ethics. There'll be some brief discussion of ethics, but it's mostly going to be on the more economics, politics, practicality, and engineering side of things, because that is, I think, the area of interest for me at the minute, because as things have come in contact with reality, we've discovered some problems, and I think it'd be worth incorporating those problems into our arguments and debates. So, first we must ask, what is the computer? To massively oversimplify it, essentially what generative AI and other neural networks do is they get trained on some kind of database, that's usually images or text or letters or whatever. And then you essentially, you train it on that, then you tune that using specifically the hyperparameters using a validation set. That's quite often done by physical real life people. And then the model is tested on new unseen data or the test data set, which validates that it says, you know, what you say it's going to do. Essentially, it's slightly confusing, I feel, but they should be named the other way around. The problem is that some problems have arisen with generative AI and using data sets that we just started to notice. And the reason for this is essentially just that they use an insane amount of data. There was one recently which was using an AI for predicting music lyrics, and they essentially scraped the entire internet of every music lyric to a video ever for their one sort of minor AI product. So that's a massive amount of data. And the problem is that there are copyright infringements and all of those sort of various issues with this. And what's happening now is that there's a lot of websites specifically are now using tools which allow them to block scraping, data scraping, which prevents you from accessing the amount of data that you need to produce your model in the first place. The other problem here is sort of legal challenges. We've seen this a little bit more in the sphere of Hollywood with SAG-AFTRA strike. and the question of how much of this is actually useful in the first place. And the final problem I would note here is that when you run out of internet to scrape, which is occurring quite rapidly, you end up generating the internet, which you then re-scrape afterwards, which means that you incorporate more and more generated AI content into the data that you're using to validate the AI-generated content, and that causes issues in terms of model collapse. Whether you can prove that in the debates, I think, is somewhat speculative, but I think you probably can prove that the quality of data available is decreasing just through surface level observation of what the internet looks like now, and that's at minimum bad for the world. But again, I think a key limitation here for most companies now is being able to actually access data in a way which isn't illegal. You can probably prove an incentive, which means that they are likely to do things like, for example, scrape entire libraries against people's permission, which they're currently trying to get away with now. The other problem is that you need someone to do the validation. And that means you need to have a real physical person who verifies that your image of a dog is actually an image of a dog, and not an image of a dog with 5 legs. The problem is that is cheap labor, and what ends up happening typically is this labor is essentially outsourced. There's been a few stories which have just come up recently of the kind of people that are employed. It's generally very poor people in countries like Kenya. And what often happens is because these are working with large image data sets, there are a lot of very unpleasant images on the internet, and that essentially means that the people are being paid very, very little to view very, very unpleasant images all the time. The plight of internet moderators has been well known for a while, but this is definitely a new dimension and a new ethical challenge. I know I wouldn't focus too much on ethics, but this is also a practical concern for companies in that they have to be able to do this validation, and it becomes very difficult when all your workers are extremely traumatized. Now, the Edinburgh connection. I thought this was fun. So, this is the third round of AI investment, which I think is something cool to mention in the debate, because it gives you a nice little bit of historical context and appeal to authority. In 1973, there was a thing called the Lighthill Report, which affected our great and proud institution, and that brought about the first AI winter. And what the Lighthill Report essentially did was it categorized AI products into 3 different categories. There was advanced automation, which is basically factories. There was B, which is building robots, and also the kind of first chatbots, text-to-speech type bots, which were sort of starting to emerge at that period of time. And then C, computer-based CNS studies, which is basically just modeling the brain. The conclusion here was that category B is really, really hard. And that is still true in that if you look at any video of a general purpose robot trying to do anything, it's fucking useless. It's really, really difficult to be able to actually do that because the number of variables increases so quickly, and it's therefore not very feasible. But recently what's happened in the past 10 years or so is that the chatbot thing has managed to actually be able to work. And the reason for that is there's been a sort of new invention in terms of deep learning, but there's also just been a really massive increase in the amount of computing power, because of course Mr. Lighthill was dealing with, well, he's probably a doctor or something, was dealing with a couple of terabytes of computing data, whereas now we have terabytes, and therefore you can just kind of crunch the numbers on this thing and start to make computers and text-to-speech work, kind of. I know if you've ever seen the YouTube text-to-speech generator, it's usually not very, or speech-to-text generator, it's not very good. So that essentially ended up killing a lot of the research in AI at Edinburgh. Of course, this never happened again, and everything was harmonious between the British government and Edinburgh University. No, they cancelled the most recent one, basically for the same reason, although it's a little bit more due to budget cuts, so that's something which continues to be a problem this day in terms of AI and research funding. You can mechanize this in debate by saying the public sector use of AI is increasingly untenable, which means that any benefits that someone who is making a pro-AI argument might claim to achieve run into issues when it's quite difficult to be able to achieve the kind of funding for this sort of thing in the first place outside the private sector. The next thing is energy. Energy becomes an issue when you're processing so much data at scale. If you look at ChatGPT's emissions, they've increased by 87,000%. Now that's a slightly mean number for me to choose because obviously their user base has grown quite significantly, but it's grown significantly less than the increase in energy. So the increase in energy has massively outstripped the number of prompts being suggested. And the key problem here is that data centers are beginning to be opened in water-stressed regions, places like Chile and Mexico, essentially due to the rapid development. I put this in bold because that's a debate which keeps on happening. even though I don't particularly like it. But if you want to make an argument in a rapid development debate, then the problem with rapid development is it leads to bad decisions being made in terms of ecological planning as people rush to get stuff out the door as opposed to carefully considering it. This is often done by cash-strapped local authorities or countries with short-term tax revenue, like the UK, for example, along with Mexico, who sort of love to approve this kind of stuff at the minute. Data centers themselves also produce very, very few jobs because they're largely insulated. I think the number is typically about 30 per center, which is almost nothing for an infrastructure project of this kind of scale and this kind of resource use. And again, because of rapid development, this gold rush is likely to lead to a large number of stranded assets which might not be able to be used for many things if there's not significant return on investment. So for example, when NVIDIA says we're building our own AI chip which is exclusively for AI, you kind of ask the question, well, what happens if less AI is being used? You now have a lot of chips which aren't very useful and are ended up being stranded assets. Yeah.
Often in debates, like teams are like, oh, AI is going to reduce so many jobs. And then you respond by saying, automation, obviously not. And then they're like, no, but structurally, like, they have to create jobs, otherwise people will be out of jobs. And also there's loads of regulation jobs. Like, how do you prove structurally that they're likely to automate?
That's the next slide. I'm going to be talking about automation, but
On the previous slide.
yeah.
You said the first layer of investment is 1973. This third one is now. When was the second one?
It was 1980s, I think. The thing is, it got killed off in the UK by the Light report, but it continued on in America for a little bit. But the reason the early law died out is basically just because there wasn't enough computing power, and that's why it's back now. But the problem specifically with combinatorial explosion, which is just increasing complexity, once you start to model beyond sort of very simple tasks with defined scope, still remains, which is why these models are so expensive to train. So this is again assuming the assets can even be built, because the problem is the key limit here is not just building the data center itself, but expanding the grid of energy which it relies upon in order to be able to actually function. And that is very technically demanding and very slow. If you want a nice intuition problem, you can talk about how useless your utility company is, but just imagine them having to sort of double their capacity in Northern Virginia in the space of 2 years, which is what they're sort of expected to be able to do. It's quite difficult for you to be able to do this. Again, a nice argument in the rapid development debate, because it can kind of go either way. You can either go, well, the rapid development won't actually be that rapid, so then we mitigate some of your responses. Or you can go, well, the rapid development won't be that rapid, and therefore it's bad. It's pretty simple. You need to build pylons. That kind of stuff is highly regulated. It takes time to be able to do it. The other thing here is that, unlike traditional SaaS companies, which is software as a service, each user added consumes much more power and therefore cost, and each model also requires more data and therefore more power too. Which is to say, if you, as Amazon, make Amazon Web Service, right? Like the cost of you making Amazon Web Service is kind of fixed in or like for example, the Adobe Photoshop only has to be updated every 2 years or so, and once you've got a basic platform, you can kind of work on that, whereas ChatGPT has to be continually reinvented and invested vast amounts of money to in each funding round, which means that you're getting exponentially more expensive each time you run this. There's also the user cost is so much higher because of the energy demand, which means that each time you add one person, there's very much a diminishing return in terms of the value you can get for them. You end up having to extract more and more, money out of them for you to be able to use the service in the first place. Again, the problem with all of this is you think, well, why don't companies just, be clever and stop doing this stuff and just go for something which is more energy efficient, which is probably possible. The reason for this is that in order to raise the venture capital funding to be able to actually sell their product in the first place, the new model has to improve its accuracy. Again, the problem with this is that accuracy itself has diminishing returns. It's kind of a slope curve. You get pretty accurate, and then after that, you need vastly more data, and therefore vastly more energy. And now we're sort of getting to the kind of almost idiotic, farcical phase of this, where people are talking about reopening 3 Mile Island in order to power a data center. I don't know what to say about that, but it's a fun example of it. Right, now, to bring on your question, we're talking about the macroeconomics. So there was a Goldman Sachs PDF study, which is why I wrote this thing, you should listen to it in the first place, which talks about the economic impact of AI. And it was quite a big deal recently because it was the first thing to sort of throw a bit of shade on the otherwise pretty positive news that it had been proceeding previously. And this guy I really like, I have no idea how you say his name, but he's some smart guy at American University. And essentially his estimate, I read the paper, it was pretty good, although I'm not an economist, so take it with a grain of salt, is that only around 4.6% of tasks can be estimated. I think this makes intuitive sense in the debate if you think about the number of professions which can actually be fully done by a chatbot, as opposed to say just firing and rehiring. You know, there's been a few examples in the UK of like people trying to automate teaching by making ChatGPT your kid's teacher. If you spend any time around kids, I feel like it's kind of intuitive that that's not good. What's probably going to happen is there's going to be a few niche cases, but don't necessarily revolutionize behavior. Again, the other problem here is that even if accuracy does improve, because these are kind of vague and fluffy, it's very difficult for you to say this investment makes it twice as good. So how can ChatGPT be twice as good at summarizing an article? That's something which is quite difficult to measure. So you put in all this return, but then does twice as good mean that people are actually willing to pay twice as much for their ChatGPT subscription? Kind of difficult to tell. The other thing here is that, and this is the main thing from the paper, is that because of this low number of tasks being automated, it's likely that there's going to be a low increase in total factor productivity, which means that the actual productivity generated by using ChatGPT will be constrained to a small number of sectors. And if you want to back that up in the debate, you can say, well, the unemployment rate here tracks pretty well, which seems to suggest that even if tasks are being automated, they're certainly not being revolutionized, because almost no one is being fired as a result of this. You can see that the general economic trend for unemployment is pretty similar across the board. So AI is not really having any impact on the number of people being displaced in the labour market at the minute, which is really important because one of the key claims of the macroeconomics of AI is that you displace a large number of people from the labour market and then they get new and better jobs. But if they're not being displaced in the first place, or they're not being rehired, then that kind of becomes an issue because then you're not generating much value. Now, separate from productivity is GDP, and the GDP estimates are slightly better in that the GDP estimates are usually about 0.9% over a decade, which is quite a lot of money. I'm maybe not as convinced in that one as I am with the productivity, but it seems pretty legit. The problem is none of these estimates, or at least most of the ones I can find which sort of had any level of credibility, match the level of spending proposed. And even if they did, an increase in GDP isn't necessarily a good thing. So more goods and services might be exchanged, making deepfakes or revenge porn, but obviously that's not providing value to society, even by the very sort of blunt tool instrument of productivity. And therefore, I'm not in a debate. I think you can actually, for once, mechanize that an increase in GDP is not a universal good for society. That's a can of worms to open, but I think this is quite a nice example to go for it. The other macroeconomic trend that you run into here is that there is now a bubble in the chip supply market, a market famous for not being good at bubbles. And if it is true that these chips are the shovels for the gold rush, and then confidence is damaged, well, there's a lot of money which has gone in a very short space of time into the chip supply market, which will then have been lost. Recently, I think we've all heard about Asheville, but actually quite near Asheville is one of the main suppliers of high quality quartz. So I think we're looking at another period of bust for the chip supply market, which doesn't particularly bode well for the macroeconomics of AI. Again, maybe proven wrong on this stuff, but I think you probably could argue convincingly in the debate that the rapid rollout and rapid spending of any money on any one particular industry is a very high risk strategy for your economy to take, and in the past hasn't worked out, especially when you've got limited regulation. Okay, SoftBank. I just love talking about Masayoshi Son, it's my favorite thing. OpenAI recently became a for-profit company, as you would probably heard in the news. In the last year, it lost $5 billion, and this year it just managed to raise $6.6 billion for the first round of funding. Now, the reason I'm talking about them specifically is we've talked about the macroeconomic trends, but now I'm going to talk about the microeconomic trends to explain why the macroeconomic picture is probably not so rosy. However, so the money that they've raised in the first round of funding is pretty impressive, but most of it is from Microsoft, which is probably cloud compute credits, which means Microsoft allows them to sort of borrow their servers for people to run instead of actually giving them physical dollars in cash. And it's money from investors, if you look at the list, like SoftBank, Tiger Global, Andreessen Horowitz, the holy trinity of idiocy. And also the Abu Dhabi Wealth Fund, which is a throwback to our previous CT. These VC funds' business model in general requires quite significant returns because they're taking high risk, usually in the realm of sort of 10 to 100 times. And that would require a valuation of 1.5 trillion in the next decade, which seems pretty improbable to me. That makes these investors quite scary and spooky, and I don't know if after, say, 2 years, if they're not seeing the same return because they're such big spenders and such high risk takers, that is a consistent source of funding for the company as opposed to what it's previously relied on, which is Microsoft, which is a pretty consistent source of funding. OpenAI itself only aims for sort of 100 billion in profit by then, which is about half that of Google, but again, that means you've got a brand new company becoming essentially one of the largest tech companies in the world in under a decade, which is a very impressive claim to make. The problem is that compared to traditional tech companies like Google, the costs are far higher per customer because of what we've talked about earlier in terms of generating stuff, and the business itself is also more exposed to energy and chip shocks because Google doesn't really need that many data centers to operate. I mean, it needs a massive global infrastructure, but compared to the amount required for generative AI, it's kind of dwarfed. And it's also, not as heavily reliant on using vast amounts of energy because it is running, again, that smaller number of data centers, and their product isn't just data centers. If that makes sense, the product isn't just chips. So it is unclear how resilient OpenAI is to shocks. And then, again, it's also unclear how many users would be willing to pay a subscription, given that most people don't do that for Google. So the problem is here we've got very high costs, we've got risky and somewhat speculative investment, we've got exposure to global supply chain shocks, and then not looking so good. And we can sort of start to see the early kind of wobbles in the company. It's definitely had a big staff exodus in the past couple of months, which is something I've been noticing in the news tick up, and I think that could be due to sort of anger over how the company's being run, but it could also be due to concerns about the financial stability of the company. If you read the Financial Times at the minute, it's sort of every third article they have on the tech industry talks about this as a major source of risk. Just to give you an idea, again, of the kind of people who run SoftBank, my favorite, Mr. Song, loves to quote Yoda to investors. I was talking about listening to the Force. So, this is a guy who has burned, I think, 12 billion recently when it's like dropped. So he's essentially a compulsive gambler and is known in the business for this kind of thing. I'm sorry for anyone who's worked with SoftBank, but when SoftBank is the main backer of your company, you're in trouble. And all of this feeds back into the macroeconomic problems with AI, which is that in order to achieve those macroeconomic benefits in the first place, the microeconomics of the companies, in order to supply the confidence of the market, has to be good. And if the big name company was to go under or otherwise implode catastrophically as a result of this, then the macroeconomics would be even more called into question. And then, the idea of selling vast amounts of chips and therefore Nvidia's stock price being so high also becomes an issue. So, I think that's the end. Yes, that is the end. In conclusion, I think that an underutilized argument in AI debates is just the limits of the capacity and the usefulness of the technology, as opposed to any sort of ethical issues surrounding with them, even though I do think that they exist, and there are other workshops which you can watch which go into this in great detail, talking about deepfakes and fire and rehire policies and animation and so on. All arguments which you should combine to be able to make a more convincing argument, I think, here, which is to call into question the effectiveness and the stability of the technology, combined with the ethical problems, and then suddenly you have a much, much more convincing case in debates opposed to AI. Okay, any questions? No? Grant, I think we just about